first time I'm really happy to welcome our own division of Urban and Regional Studies, because thanks to our head of department, Maria Håkansson, this 11th installment of Athena lecture with Professor Fran Tonkiss is part of our research day. And I think the topic is also very much in sync with what we have been discussing the last 3 hours. For those of you that don't know, this is I need to use high-end words now, an extraordinary series that doesn't exist anywhere in the world, and MIT wants to copy it now. We'll see if they manage to do it. But it consists of distinguished 20 scholars that are coming from different fields, strands of different disciplines, everything from urban studies, urban sociology, landscape architecture, even political science, have dedicated their time to sort of give these talks at KTH. So as I said, this is the 11th one, and it's also part of our, because the series is part of the Center for the Future of Places, and it's part of our biennial research team, which is called Urban Disclosures and Cities for All. So today I have this privilege to welcome back again for the third time Professor Fran Tonkiss from London School of Economics, and I will, as those of you that have attended this series before, you know that I always put a collage together, and you can still, find all kinds of stuff in Google. But what this really tells you about is Professor Tonkiss's background. She's a professor of sociology and deputy head of department, but you were the director of LSE Cities before Suzanne Hall.
Cities program
Before Suzanne Hall took over, yeah. Research and teaching is in the field of urban and economic sociology, and it focuses on urban inequalities, urban development and design, social and spatial divisions, and socio-economic organization of spaces. Exactly what a lot of things we do. And also you are an expert on Louis Wirth.
Yes.
Well,
a fan.
Urbanism as a way of life, 1920 something, right? Also the publications, I think I remember when this came out, sort of became an instant popular book for many of us. It is By Design, The Social Life of Urban Form. But you also had other ones, the books from Contemporary Economic Sociology from 2000, and especially Space, the City and Social Theory. That's the one I read, and that's from 2005. All of these key works. And now you're the managing editor of Economy and Society, and you were previously the editor of British Journal of Sociology. So without any further ado, I will welcome back Fran, and it's great to have you here.
Thank you, Tigran. Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you all for coming this afternoon. I know there are competing claims on everyone's time, not least a major event, but I think we may well be out of here before kickoff for those of you who are interested in that, as I certainly am. It's always a pleasure to come to KTH and to Stockholm. And when Tigran first contacted me with the idea of the Athena series, I was incredibly excited by the concept and really very honored to be included in the list of women urbanists that were going to be invited to participate. I'm just going to put this back here because I love this graphic, and I think I'm going to ask for it to be put on my departmental website in the future to replace the headshot. Part of the inspiration, I know, for putting together a series of lectures by women critics, thinkers, analysts, and scholars was the legacy of Doreen Massey, who was, as I'm sure all of you will know, a British geographer who died far too early in 2016. And she was part of the inspiration for putting this series together, and I think she's been an inspiration for many of us, certainly in the UK context, but more generally, who have been engaged with the spatial and social sciences from, I would say, a progressive as well as a female perspective. And so I want to really deal with issues today that are inspired in part by Massey's approach, but also my own position in the field as an urban sociologist. Tigran has referred to the range of thinkers that have been here in the series already and will continue. I must say number 11 is a favorite number of mine, so I'm pleased to be number 11 in the series. It's something of a lucky number. And Doreen Massey, who was a geographer by training and by disposition, nonetheless spoke far more broadly beyond her particular disciplinary field to others who are concerned with the workings of space, social relations, material forms, and so on. And she was especially concerned with the generative power of space, not necessarily the causative power of space, but the ways in which the arrangement of space with people's interactions with and in space were generative of the social. Her work also showed a wonderful ability to connect larger processes and dynamics, economic, material process. She began her geographical life as a Marxist thinker, and she never really left that particular sensibility behind, even in the post-Marxist moment in the social sciences. And part of this, I think, was her enduring capacity to link broad dynamics, big processes, large structures, with local contexts and effects. She sought to read the world as it surfaced, for example, in her local high street in North London, Kilburn High Road. You may have read the article that she based on that space, thinking about the way the world came to ground in these kinds of local spaces. So these are the kinds of influences that I want to draw on in the session that we have here today, to think about urban inequalities both in terms of large structures and dynamics that shape our cities and shape our urban lives, but also to think about more local interactions, places, and relations, and the smaller acts that both serve to reproduce larger inequalities, but also might address them. Now, as an urban sociologist, I'm very used to analyzing social and spatial problems in the city, whereas those of you who are engaged in the more practical field of design are always seeking to craft solutions. If you're largely a social scientist, you have the sort of perfection of correct analyses. You don't necessarily deal with the imperfections of semi-successful or sometimes failed attempts at shaping spaces of social life. So I want to bring that design sensibility together with a more sociological approach. Now, let me begin first of all by saying something about the organization of inequalities in contemporary cities, and I then want to talk about interventions which might seek to respond to these inequalities as questions of design both for policy and planning, as well as questions for design for physical interventions in space. I would put it to you that the way in which urban disparities are shaped in the city today occurs very much at the intersection of some emerging patterns of inequality with far more enduring relations of inequality in the city and elsewhere. So as you all know, urban economies the world over, including in our local context here, are changing towards a greater emphasis on services and indeed a greater reward for those working in certain parts of the service economy, in finances, in tech, in producer services, as Saskia Sassen has spoken of, and declining rewards in the economy for those whose income is reliant on their labor. So declining shares of urban and national income go to wage labor, increasing shares go to high-grade service inputs, but also to forms of capital. You may be familiar with the work of Thomas Piketty, who has talked about capital in the 21st century as one of the key vectors of inequality, the way that capital begets capital, the returns to capital, including property capital, that are driving economic inequalities at the top. And I include here an image from the property pages of the London Evening Standard, which is the one evening newspaper that's published in London. And it compares the classic monopoly board prices, what you could pick up a property on Bond Street for when playing Monopoly, to the average rental price, the average room rental price in 2015. So looked at the equivalent number of days rent it would take you to pick up one of these properties in a monopoly board. And of course, property pages in evening newspapers know an awful lot about capital, about real estate, and about urban inequalities. We know that in the EU generally, post-crisis in particular, urban inequality is being driven by falling employment rates within the broader economy and with a falling wage share in our urban economies. So more more of the income of cities and of nations is going towards capital, towards those who own property and other forms of capital, and less those who sell their labor for a wage. This has gone together with eroding social protections in many advanced welfare states as elsewhere. And I think considering contemporary urban inequalities really forces us to work against standard distinctions between rich world and poor world cities, between high income and low income economies. Not to say that these kinds of spaces are the same or inequality is being produced in the same ways globally, but that there are commonalities, there are family resemblances in the way that capital is reshaping cities, whether you're talking about Stockholm or London or Shanghai, and also the very tenacious hold that certain enduring forms of inequality continue to have on our contemporary cities. And it's the latter that I really want to focus on here. Enduring forms of inequality which are based not on economic factors, but on forms of social distinction. They're not necessarily urban in their origin, but they take on very acute, very stubborn forms of disparity in our cities. So I'm concerned here with social distinctions around gender and sexuality, race and ethnicity, physical capacity, and legal status. These are all non-economic and they're all non-urban. But I'm interested in the way that these become concentrated and often very chronic in terms of economic and other inequalities in the city. In thinking about enduring gender inequalities, we are concerned with women's access to employment, women's access to property, to equal rights under the law, but signally in cities also women's right to public space and public expression. The image here is of women in Cairo protesting against violence and abuse by the military in their policing of public spaces. Or here, a radical protest by women in Lima, Peru, declaring that they should have control over their bodies in terms of reproductive rights, but also freedom from harassment, from sexual violence, and menace in the public spaces of the city. And here, this is a rather topical one, given events starting today. This is a protest against homophobia in Russia in the context of the Sochi Winter Olympics in 2014. So for gendered subjects, for subjects whose subjectivity is shaped in terms of sexual identities, the right to be in the city on equal terms as others, unmarked, free from harassment and violence, is a battle that continually needs to be fought in very different kinds of cities the world over. And the sorts of movements that we see around these truly are international. There has been a great deal of urban protest in the last decade, as you know, in response to financial crisis, in response to forms of political repression, in response to austerity, in response to the policing of various kinds of subjectivity. From the Arab Spring to the Occupy movements to Gezi Park in Istanbul to the Umbrella movement in Hong Kong, these have taken on urban form, being concentrated in urban settings, even if the origins are not always urban in character. And something else that's been quite distinctive about these movements is the presence of women within the crowd, sometimes represented as victims of police violence or indeed violence but on the part of other protesters. We saw that in Gezi, we saw that in Tahrir Square, we saw it in the Umbrella movement and in Occupy New York with accounts of sexual and homophobic and transphobic violence in these various contexts. But apart from that image of the woman or the queer subject as victim, we've also seen quite powerful images of the expression of gendered and sexual identities in the streets and the squares. What have been called by Diane Davis and her colleagues the urban infrastructure of insurgency. The roads, the roundabouts, the plazas, the squares, in which these forms of protest and public expression take form. Another vector of enduring inequality in the city and elsewhere is organized along lines of race and ethnicity. Now, this image here shows a sort of a faux, well, it's an actual entrance, but it's an installation at the entrance into the Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg, which replicates the kind of raced entrances and exits, the organization of space along racialized lines at urban level, at regional level, and certainly within public spaces under the apartheid system. This is now a museum piece. It's an act of memory and of testimony. But it doesn't and shouldn't belie the fact of the continuing grip of racial histories, of apartheid, of slavery, of segregation, both legal and voluntary, so-called, in the shaping of our cities today, such that Southern Africa, South Africa in particular, I was going to say boasts, it's entirely the wrong word, I'm looking for another verb, witnesses the most extreme urban inequalities in the world. In the richest economy in the world, the United States, which also has very high, not comparable to South Africa, but for developed world economies and for states with fairly intact welfare structures, it has very high levels of inequality. This is very largely due to the continuing effects of race, in particular the disadvantage of African Americans in the city. And a third social origin of inequality, which is not urban in a causal sense, but becomes very sharply manifest within urban locations, are forms of inequality that are organized along lines of legal status, immigration status in particular. This is an image taken from recent protests in Wisconsin, as it so happens, on a day of protest where Latino, and I should say Latina, and other migrant subjects in the US city came together to say, think about what if we took Latinos and Latinas out of your urban economy? What if we took the work of migrants out? In response to the ratcheting up of anti-migrant and indeed anti-refugee sentiment in the United States from the very top level down, with quite a nice riff on the Trumpian slogan of just who it is that makes America great. I want to remark here, alongside the points I've been trying to underline about how these non-urban and non-economic forms of social differentiation and social distinction become realized in terms of very acute economic disparities and insecurities in the city, as well as forms of physical insecurity and unsafety. But also the way that intersections between them are very crucial for thinking about the inequality of our cities today. And finally, of course, the way in which these abiding, embedded inequalities in cities in very different national and economic contexts are met by forms of organization, by mobilization, by protest, by citizen and indeed non-citizen action in various forms. Some of the most acute inequalities that we find in European cities such as Stockholm and London, my own hometown, are formed around these legal distinctions, the precarious legality of different kinds of subjects in the city. Subjects whose rights to housing, to access employment, welfare, and other services are constrained in various ways by the insecurity or indeed the illegality of their migration status. But also others whose national migration status is not insecure in quite the same way, but nonetheless lack access to the full realization of citizenship in European cities and beyond. the most disadvantaged, the single most disadvantaged population in European cities are Roma populations, who are European citizens, have access to European space on the same basis, in principle, as other European citizens, and nonetheless are subject to very chronic levels of poverty, insecurity, and violence in cities across our European space. And we might also think about the work of social dumping, as Gareth Millington has called it, of those in receipt of welfare, other kinds of minorities on the urban margins, the spatial sorting of differentiated citizenships in the city. This begins to get at the way that inequalities become spatialized, both broadly and in more local and smaller spaces. The great theorist of social policy, and indeed of the welfare state, who was himself at the London School of Economics, T.H. Marshall, wrote in 1950 of the way that citizenship has itself become, he says, the architect of legitimate social inequality. Now, Marshall, writing at this time, was referring to the way in which formal equality under the law did not in itself translate into substantive equality in relation to welfare, in relation to the exercise of one's rights, in relation to the realization of one's personhood. It's a very common argument in debates around the formation of the welfare state that legal citizenship was not enough if one did not have equal access to housing, to education, to health, to services, to dignity of various kinds. But I think Marshall's quote takes on a new resonance in our time, a time of widespread migration and what's often referred to as a migration crisis in Europe, and the way in which citizenship is differentiated both at the national legal level and then in terms of how it is lived in different urban and peri-urban spaces. So cities tend to spatialize these kinds of inequality in terms of patterns of separation and division that exist at a kind of a gross scale. This is an image that I've shown before of the sort of visual, the legible disparity between different cities within the same space. Looking from the Swiss Re building in the City of London, the financial centre of London, likes to think of itself as the financial centre of Europe, towards Docklands, the secondary financial centre in that city, across that landscape, which my colleague Sharon Zukin, who I know has been here earlier in this series, has described as the difference between a landscape of power and the vernacular landscape of the everyday city. An everyday city which is, of course, gentrifying as well as dumping in quite a complex pattern of neighbourhood change in between those two poles. The urban economists, Ananat, has spoken of the way in which urban form, the physical form of cities, works as a technology for creating segregation. And she's looking here at the histories of the way that infrastructure, she's talking in particular about rail infrastructure in this article, worked to produce and reproduce effects of racial segregation in the city, in the US city over time. So this is an economist taking an historical view, a woman economist, I should add, taking an historical view of the way that racial segregation was shaped by urban infrastructures, and it's an effect that we still see at work today at that gross scale, but also at far more local scales in terms of micro-segregations in which people organize themselves on streets and street corners in the apparently shared spaces of urban life around group identifications, economic and social distinctions. In thinking then about the way in which these enduring inequalities around gender and sexuality, around race and ethnicity, around legal status in particular, continue to underpin the emerging economic property capital-based inequalities in our cities. I'm trying to think as a sociologist of inequality in a relational sense. This is something that I would take from the work of thinkers such as Doreen Massey, but it's also an important sociological contribution to the analysis of inequality, thinking of this as something that is based on social relations and is worked out relationally. When we think about economic inequalities, we often think about these in terms of structural hierarchies. Income shares, for example. This, I just want to make the graphic point about the way in which economic inequality tends to be visualized, but in terms of the content, it's showing basically the way in which the bottom 10% of the population in London, on the far left of the table, radically lost its share of wealth between 2010 and 2014, so just in the post-crisis period by over 30%, whereas the top 10% of income earners increased their share of the wealth by about 25% over the same period. So, and a similar kind of graphic for distributions of income towards the top earners, top 1% income share in New York City, New York State, and the USA. My point is that we think about these in terms of distributions of income and wealth and a kind of structural hierarchy. But in fact, the way that inequality is lived in cities and elsewhere is not necessarily in terms of distributions or neatly organized hierarchies or segmentations between different income groups. It's lived relationally. It's lived in terms of our interactions with each other and our access to forms of space. It's lived relationally in ways which are often quite radical and conflictual. This is an image taken from the Charlottesville protests. You will remember that one of the anti-fascist protesters was killed in the course of these protests, but this is an encounter between white supremacist, neo-Nazi protesters and anti-fascist protesters. Very good people on both sides, as we remember, was the description by one who doesn't know. This is clearly a sense in which relational inequalities, disparities, social differentiations become live in the spaces of the city. But more routinely, forms of inequality, forms of difference, are worked out in terms of patterns of interaction and non-interaction on the streets and in the spaces of the city. The Swedish sociologist Göran Thurborn, who spent many years working in Britain, most recently at the University of Cambridge, has referred to these forms of inequality in terms of existential inequalities, a term that I've found very helpful in my own thinking about inequality. And Thurborn uses this notion of existential inequality, and he's also concerned with inequalities in resources, and inequalities, for example, in health and mortality outcomes. But this third vector of inequality with which he's concerned, existential inequality, has to do with disparities of dignity, disparities of autonomy, freedom, opportunity, and self-determination. He's not thinking specifically about the city, but the city, as always, provides a space, quite literally as well as metaphorically, for us to think about the way in which these existential inequalities come to be lived through interactions and non-interactions in experiential space. Thurborn describes what he calls unequal allocations of personhood. Again, I think this is a really powerful expression. Unequal allocations of personhood across those categories of gender, of sexuality, of race and ethnicity, and in particular the unequal allocation of personhood across categories of legal belonging and rights. Often, these forms of inequality, perhaps most often, become expressed very acutely as economic inequalities. But this is not their origin. And it's not always or necessarily the most violent or the most sharp ways in which they are experienced. So why, before I turn to design interventions on the part of governments and spatial designers, why should we think about this as a problem? And this, I guess, is something which I rehearse every time I think about or talk about the question of inequality, because quite often, it just takes one person to locate the black swan in the room and say, if we don't, why do we think economic inequality or other kinds of inequality are problems in the city? It's just a fact of life. It's a fact of living in a capitalist society. It's a fact of living in a patriarchal society, and so on. And depending on where you stand, it's not necessarily a moral, an ethical, or a political problem. But from an urban standpoint, we can say that inequalities in the city are economically irrational, insofar as urban form works as a technology of segregation, which displaces and peripheralizes the urban poor or impacts the urban poor in underserved neighborhoods. This is counter to the dynamism of an urban economy, where you want people to be able to access labor markets quickly and easily. You don't want people to spend hours trying to cram themselves onto a bus or many buses to get to their place of work from their remote place of residence. It doesn't make economic sense in a market-driven urban economy for urban form to reproduce these spatialized patterns of segregation in this way. It also doesn't make sense environmentally, given the way that urban economies tend to reproduce geographies of harm, of risk, of pollution and emission in very, very uneven ways. Both across global space, the way in which rich world economies tend to outsource their pollution and many of their emissions as they outsource their production and their waste, but also the way these unequal environmental geographies are distributed within cities, affecting the kind of vital inequalities with which Thurborn is also concerned. And urban inequality is socially toxic. It is productive of conflict. It is costly in terms of having to police and secure a divided city, whether you're talking about the elaborate morphologies of gating in many very unequal cities around the world. And I referred to Johannesburg earlier, or the cost of policing a conflictual and divided city. This is an image taken from the so-called consumer riots in London in the summer of 2012, where urban disadvantage of a very routine, very ordinary, very widespread way was realized in police and public rioting, looting, and civil unrest. So these forms of inequality along these various lines can be seen as unsustainable, as irrational, and as corrosive of urbanism. Cities concentrate such forms of inequality. But cities also provide contexts in which they might be, if not resolved, at least addressed, mitigated, circumvented in various ways. So I want to speak now for the rest of the time that remains, to me at least, of two relationships of design to these kinds of issues. And I take the concept of design, as always, broadly. Firstly, to refer to government policy planning designs, the work of policymakers and planners as architects of the social, and how this impacts on urban spaces. And then to think a little more specifically about practices of physical and spatial design in the more classic disciplinary sense, the work of architects, urban designers, planners again, engineers, and so on. I've said that many of these urban inequalities are the outcomes of very broad processes of capitalist restructuring, processes of patriarchal disparity, processes of racial and ethnic and cultural differentiation. These, of course, are very large problems which need very fundamental solutions. But what I want to concentrate on here are the smaller, more local, more spatial acts that designers in governments and designers in design practices might take to respond in a relational way to some of the ways in which inequality is shaped in cities. Because an urban government, let alone an architect, can always say, there's nothing I can do about economic disparity in my city. You need to speak to the national government, or you need to speak to the 1% or the 0.1%. I can't change those underlying relationships. And this is probably true. But the power that urban designers, in that broader sense, do have is to shape the fabrics of their city and the relational lives that are lived within them. So I want to talk about interventions on the part of government along 5 lines, and how these smaller acts can produce a more equal city, can participate in the search for equality in our urban environments. The first of these has to do with issues of distribution in the city and deliberation over the way that resources are distributed. I noticed on the cash register in the cafe here, there is a sticker promoting a fair pay campaign. And these kinds of local and urban campaigns are incredibly important in altering people's lives. The London Living Wage is one example of this, which is a citywide initiative to try and increase on the national minimum wage in recognition of the costs of living in such an expensive city. So anyone who works for or works for a contractor of the London government under Sadiq Khan will receive a London living wage rather than the national basic wage. And the GLA uses its leverage to try and bring the private employers with who it operates into conformity with this. It can't legislate, it can't change the national minimum wage, but what it can do is to promote an urban living wage. And this is just one example of many around the world. We take, of course, many of these cues from governments and social actors in poor world and middle income settings. So the conventional traffic of ideas from global north to global south, the generalization from the centers of North America and Western Europe is really reversed in many of these designs against inequality. This is about learning from the global south, and it's about learning from activist governments and social movements in lower income contexts. So the forms of participatory budgeting that we associate with this kind of urban emphasis on creative redistribution originates in Brazilian cities, in Porto Alegre and Curitiba and cities such as this, but have begun to spread around the world. And actually, this is quite an old graphic now. This is several years old, but it attempts to map some participatory budgetary initiatives throughout the world. Very, very concentrated in the European space, but it's been generalized across cities in South America and in Africa. It looks like somebody's doing it in Sydney as well, and regionally across the world. North America hasn't quite taken off in this respect, but of course has a model in the United States where budgeting is quite devolved at city level in any case. We might think about designs for governing the city in respect of environment and energy services, dealing with some of those environmental inequities which are so toxic in many cities. This is an example from Bengaluru, which I like to show a new strategy at city level for solid waste management, which a former student of mine, who's an architect by training, but took her design skills in terms of thinking through problems and thinking about solutions spatially into the government of waste in the city, from an overall strategy for dealing with solid waste to the return of rubbish bins into the city, which they'd been removed several years earlier, and the celebration of the garbage bin and of local recycling. These are small acts which have to do with the dignity of urban spaces and of urban residents. Thirdly, we can look to the field of planning in the way that this might form part of the search for equality in cities, through advocacy and equity planning obviously through housing strategies, whether through the provision of housing or the regulation of rents and tenures and the protection of certain kinds of tenures, the right to return, which has been developed in a number of cities in the western US, in Portland in particular, and San Francisco, i.e. where people are under threat of displacement through gentrification, they receive priority in social housing programs. They're very small scale, but for the households that come to be rehoused in the areas where they lived sometimes for decades, these of course are very real initiatives. A similar kind of scheme is being devised and in a very minimal way at the moment under the Khan Mayoralty in London, a program for living rent. So we have the London Living Wage in that context. There is a parallel program which is seeking to establish affordable rent levels through various means, given that increasingly housing is being provided through the private rental sector in a country such as this. So London is one of the most expensive cities in Europe, if not on the planet, and part of this, of course, is the extortionate costs of rents in a city where real estate is increasingly given over to speculative development. But I'm thinking not only of the work of urban governments, but of activist and citizen movements. Here's a recent mapping of anti-gentrification movements within London and indeed even beyond. It looks like, I didn't know there was gentrification going on in Woking in Surrey, but it appears that there is a mobilization against it. Transport and infrastructure, fourthly. Now clearly this is a realm where city governments have quite extensive leverage, and inequities of access can be the basis of some very acute inequalities in the city. So the government role in designing infrastructures, both green and blue, as well as hard infrastructures, is a crucial question of designing against inequality. Again, I take my first example from London, the congestion charge as an example of a traffic demand strategy that seeks to redistribute some of the costs of private and motorized transit away from those who are the recipients of its environmental harms and towards those who are using this as a mode of transit. Another example from this region of Europe, which is a street initiative in the city of Oslo, powered by the city, which removed parking spaces from this street in the center of town, put in a cycle lane, created more space for other kinds of users in the street. And I understand, actually from a Finnish student of mine who told me a few weeks ago that this street is now car-free, that in the sense that parked cars spend an awful lot of their lives being parked. This is kind of what cars do for a living. They park. And they, of course, take up a significant amount of urban space in doing so. So the parking spaces have been eradicated altogether to open up more space for other kinds of users. And of course, these sorts of initiatives in rich world European contexts such as these very much take their inspiration from poor world designs. You will all be familiar with the role that non-motorized transport infrastructures have taken in programs of social urbanism in the cities of Colombia, this is Bogota, and other South American cities. So this idea that allocations of personhood go together with allocations of space to different kinds of urban users is really inspired by these Latin American social urbanist programs. And the former and current and very shaky mayor of Bogota, Enrique Peñalosa, famously said, why should the guy in the $40,000 car have greater access to space than the guy, let's say the woman, on the $40 bicycle? There is no reason for these hierarchies of transit use and spatial distribution to reflect hierarchies of income in this way, insofar as city governments have power over them. And finally, fifthly, in respect of designs for governing against inequality, I'd refer to the role of city planning and policy in respect of urban citizenship. The way in which cities promote and protect freedoms of expression, mobility in the city, freedom of association and gathering, access to information in the city. We know that many cities now are making their data freely available through open source strategies for people to use in ways that they see fit. So greater transparency in cities, but also recognizing that data and knowledge in cities is a very significant urban resource. And rather than privatizing or protecting that, making that openly available to users. But of course also the more punitive aspects of urban citizenship, how subjectivities are policed, how expression and mobilization and gathering is policed in the city. Cities, of course, provide crucial spaces for the realization of citizenship, and many urban theorists have spoken about urban citizenship, as distinct from legal citizenship, as a substantive mode of belonging, autonomy, and self-determination. We see that in the routine spaces of protest in the city and in more eventful and spectacular modes of occupation. And the cardboard ready-made sign here saying, our dreams can't be contained in your ballot boxes, recognizing that expressions of citizenship are not simply done through electoral means. To turn then to the other way in which I want to think about design, in terms of more relational approaches to combating inequalities in the city. And this is a more classic sense, the technical sense of design, as physical designs on urban spaces. These are, the examples that I'm going to essay here are all small acts. They are, in a sense, minor practices. They don't remake the fabric of the city in a fundamentally transformative way, and they don't necessarily seek to or affect to transform capitalist social and economic relations. But I would say that they offer ways of thinking about allocations of personhood in the city, distributions of dignity and respect, and the relational nature of urban life. So I want to just finish by picking out some examples of physical designs around housing, around public realm, and around transport, which we might conceive in terms of this relational approach to urban inequality and increasing equality. Let me give you the bad side of the story, first of all. This is a recent image in Brixton in South London, a rapidly gentrifying part of the city. It has traditionally been a low-income part of the city and was a very, very important arrival point for post-war migrants into London from the Caribbean. And this, of course, has been a very heightened issue of late because of the current government's attempts to deport various of the citizens of that generation, the Windrush generation, as they're called in the UK, after the name of the boat on which the first Caribbean migrants arrived, to staff the NHS, to staff the transport system in London and elsewhere. This is in Brixton. It's a very unspectacular housing development, I think you'll agree, but it is described as a gated development of luxury mews houses. Now, the gates here are simply a gesture of distinction. There's no, I think I could get over that gate if I tried. But the point is that this is a symbolic act of symbolic violence, we might even say, after Pierre Bourdieu. But it is not a high crime area. It's not incredibly elite housing where we're used to the wish to sequester affluence away from the more ordinary parts of the city, but it is a gesture that is marking forms of social distinction and differentiation in a very diverse part of the city that still combines very different income groups. Or we also have, London offers some of the really cautionary tales around designing for inequality. The famous poor doors in mixed tenure, mixed income developments. So this is a development in outer southeast London. Again, not a particularly distinguished, but quite a large scale and dense housing development. And the door that you see on the right, which is a sort of a bit of late postmodernism, I think, in terms of the design of the entry, is the door for the market tenants, those who are purchasing or renting their homes on the private market. And the door on the left is for the social tenants, those who are accessing the affordable or socially rented housing in this development. And you will have, I'm sure, heard about the routine use of pour doors within these apparently mixed developments that work at this micro scale to reproduce space, to create small-scale segregations in space, and I would put it to you, to represent very different notions of personhood on the part of those who are using these different entrances and exits. Or in respect of public space, this is a privatized public space in London. At the rear of the photograph is the River Thames, and that gives onto the area around the new City Hall, the home of the new urban government. And we have this very commercial space in front of it. This is familiar from the world over, these kinds of privately provided public realms populated by particular kinds of users, office workers primarily, shopping and eating on their lunch breaks. Or even at a smaller scale, the kinds of sadistic street environments that can be seen to design for inequality in the city. I like this photograph, not because I like the use of the spikes to keep homeless or rough sleepers from sleeping in the on the curtilages of these office buildings, but it is the curtilage outside a real estate agent in central London. So one of the drivers, one of the leading agents in this propertied version of citizenship, of which Ananya Roy has spoken in contemporary times. And it's being subject to a bit of a derive here by some urban activists who are hanging out a few young women who are subverting the use of these, what Mike Davis called sadistic social environments. We can think about alternatives to this in respect of housing, public realm, and infrastructure. A different kind of mixed-use development mixed income, mixed tenure development in West London, which doesn't differentiate between different kinds of users, with single entrances, with undifferentiated frontages as well. There's no penthouse in this development. Or a different kind of approach, a more relational approach to the public realm, to the production of open space in the city. This is a scheme by Witherford Watson Mann architects for the creation of what they call the Bankside Urban Forest in South London, where rather than coming up with a very large new public park or open space, that's being done by the developer's Lend-Lease nearby at the Elephant and Castle as part of the redevelopment of that area, having demolished a very large-scale public housing estate. What WWM have done here is to try and link up existing sites of open, accessible and green space across this sort of integrated urban neighborhood, rather than one ceremonial, privately provided space. So they're looking to these small spaces of urban affordance, of access, and I would put it to you, of equal personhood. And finally, in respect of urban transit infrastructures, initiatives to rebalance the share of the road surface away from private motor towards non-motorized forms of transit and also collective forms of transit. So the provision of bus lanes and bicycle lanes being given priority over the road surface for car use only. And the provision of cycling infrastructures to promote these kinds of urban practice. So what I've tried to suggest in essaying these kinds of examples here is that addressing inequalities in the city has to do not only with distributions of income at a large scale, although of course it has to do with that, but this is not necessarily something which is in the power of city governments, and it's not something, most certainly, that's in the power of urban designers or planners. So addressing inequality, the search for equality in the city has to do not only with distributions of income, but with distributions of space, based on the recognition that relative advantage and disadvantage originates not only in control of resources, but also command over spaces. It has to do with the recognition and the accommodation of personhood in terms of expression and association, in terms of forms of spatial access, in terms of the ordinary urban citizenships of belonging and respect that operate below the level of the law. So if the city is to be a space of equality and recognition, I'd argue we must look not only to the broad structures and scales of government, but to the small acts of design and the everyday spaces of urban life in which our relations with each other and our expressions of ourselves become manifest. Thank you all for your attention.
I think more than ever, I think that our department is not just necessary, but is essential. Because these are the issues that we deal with. And also sometimes you think they're not connected when it comes to social life and urban form, but we can see through inequality, disparity, and these things that you showed. I think the whole tapestry, it's almost like a picture of Canaletto that you need maybe half an hour to analyze. There's really, really intricate connections. So I know there's a lot of brain power here, so I will not say too much, but I just wanted you to reflect, because last time you were here, we gave Edward Glaser an honorary doctorate at KTH, and you were sort of, so to speak, a soft speaker between Peter Nijkamp and him.
Yeah.
And of course, this whole idea of the triumph of the city, and Richard Florida now not so much retracting, but maybe coming with another type of paradigm, all these things that you talked about, that we are really have an urban crisis in the cities because the middle class is not there anymore. Things are changing very much. How would you reflect on their ideas of, and then looking back to Louis Wirth with density, size, and diversity?
I think in terms of, I very, very quickly, in a couple of sentences, referred to those forms of economic restructuring that Edward Glaser has analysed so acutely, and other urban economists have done work on also. Florida's recent work is so interesting because, of course, now he remembers that inequality in cities in the United States is about race. You know, fundamentally, this hasn't gone away. So you can talk about the reshaping of cities around new industrial sectors and new populations and forms of mobility in the city, but fundamentally, this stubborn persistence of racial inequality in the city has not disappeared. And it's, you know, at least a primary factor in shaping this. And it's very welcome, I think. The co-researcher who he's produced that work with, I'm not sure, she's definitely Scandinavian, Charlotte Melander. Yes. I'm not sure where she's from.
Jönköping, the business school at Jönköping, right?
Oh, so she's Swedish,
yes,
right.
She's
so
Swedish.
I thought it probably, it took a Swede to remind him about inequality, right? To remind an American about these issues of inequality. So I spoke less about that here, but fundamentally I accept those arguments about the capital-driven effects of economic inequality in the city. But I think it's important to come at this socially and spatially in terms of how it then is lived and experienced and the interventions that you can make at that level. So it's maybe a companion piece to that kind of thinking. Sure. I'm not so sure about the middle classes vacating the city. I think that pattern is highly variable depending on which city that you're looking at. Of course. And also it's important, I think, to look at, it's certainly the case in London. I strongly suspect it's the case in Stockholm as well, but in these other high-income cities, these internal cleavages within the middle classes as well. There is a lot of differentiation between those who we would group together, broadly speaking, as being middle class, including some really quite significant property and income wealth, as well as, the middle class populations that are just about getting by in the city, and different variations in between. And that has to do with age profiles in the city as well. You can be middle class and 25, and you live in a very different kind of city from being middle class than 55, right? So those kind of horizontal and vertical cleavages are very important, I think.
Before I let somebody come in, but you also write in your book, we shouldn't really leave the cities to architects, planners, and urban designers only, right?
No, I mean it's a collective collaboration. I mean, it's we learn from the city in that respect. Obviously, as a sociologist, I believe that cities are fundamentally social forms. They're artifacts of human agency, and they're reproduced through human agency and human relations. A colleague of mine who's a transport planner thinks that cities are transport infrastructure. That's the basis, and everything else follows from that. But we're looking at the same city through different lenses. And just as the only way we can live together in cities is collectively, I think the only way that we can study, analyze, and make cities is collectively.
One big subject maybe will come up, it's the whole issue of affordable housing. We're talking about that more and more now in Sweden, but maybe we'll touch upon it. So I'll just leave now the word to the audience, to our colleagues.
One of the things that I wanted to, I guess, pose to you, and something that I've been reflecting on a little bit, living in cities, but also from a research perspective, is cities are all about trade-offs, right? So we talk all the time, we want a city with lots of jobs, we want a city that's designed for all the different activities and experiences we want affordable housing, we want all these things. I can't think of any city that, offers all that. So when dealing with these sorts of issues, how do you make these trade-offs? How do you approach such discrepancies? And I suppose from the governance perspective and the policy perspective, how do you prioritize such issues?
I think I'm going to disagree with the opening contention of not the cities that we want, but the fact that they don't exist. I think that's what cities do. I'd be very hard-pressed to think of an example of a city, okay, Flint, Michigan, maybe, but, that doesn't produce a lot of jobs, that doesn't also accommodate very different income groups. I mean, yes, we can think of extremes. We can think of cities which really do concentrate wealth. But by and large, the normal functioning of cities is as employment centers. And cities can lose. I don't want to say cities fail, but clearly cities can undergo decline. And maybe someone like Ed Glazer would say, you know what, if they decline in this way, if cities are no longer generating jobs and livelihoods for their residents, maybe we need to shut them down and go, okay, let's invest somewhere else, or leave them to the decline. This is not necessarily something that you can reverse. And that's arguable from an economic reading of urban economies. But I think outside these exceptional cases, this is the normal functioning of cities. Employment centers, social centers, they do accommodate people at very different income levels. They have to, because they produce jobs at very different wage levels. So I think the problem then is when those kinds of ordinary inequalities, those sort of market inequalities in cities become spatialized, become embedded in the urban landscape, and become reflected in the provision of services, in the distribution of infrastructure, and in relations of social trust and respect, in the sort of interactive lives of the city. How governments prioritize those. I mean, governments have to do everything. That's the problem, don't they? Citizens do a lot. Professionals do a lot as well. But a city is always going to be a multidimensional challenge. So I'm never going to stand up here and say promoting urban economies is a bad idea, and because the best way to give someone an income is to give them, jobs are number one, right? But that has to be offset, traded off, as you might say, with the protection of urban environments that can accommodate those working populations. So maybe someone would come up with an example of a city of any kind of size and any kind of economic dynamism in which medium and lower income populations have simply been priced out. There might be some small cities which are sort of, these very elite, affluent enclaves. I don't know where lower income people live in Monte Carlo, for example. But outside of those exceptions, this is what cities do, and this is the challenge for all governments, is to accommodate that.
I guess just to bring a little more perspective, on my mind then is gentrification in that sense. So you invest in an area, you upgrade it, people get priced out, pushed somewhere else. Cities are hopefully dynamic enough to accommodate that, still within an area that allows them access to job opportunities and stuff. But I mean, you often see that people are pushed out into longer commutes and these sorts of things. And then the dynamism of cities also creates, I suppose, the inequality in cities. It also adapts as well and fixes a lot of those things. But from a policy perspective, just trying to understand how one should, I guess, frame those sorts of issues or address such issues.
Yeah. I mean, the idea, I think there is this sort of increasingly this idée fixe in urban analysis that it's the private market that does everything in cities. It's private employers that produce jobs. I mean, that's not true. Public employers are absolutely crucial in cities. Universities, for example, the health service, government in general. The public sector is a crucial part of any urban economy. And, you know, we know this very well. I'm sure that in the local area, KTH is seen as the primary employer. And by the same token, it is simply a category error, I think, to see the private market as certainly the only and possibly the primary producer of housing in the city. That hasn't been the case for the last century. This is an ideological disposition on the part of urban governments now, who are withdrawing from the sphere of housing provision. And it may be the case that urban governments are not the best at managing housing, you know, on a day-to-day basis. But the idea that housing provision, the production and distribution of housing, is simply ceded to the private sector is a very, very dangerous fallacy. And it's a fallacy on the part of government, because governments have, through planning, through building regulations, through ownership of land, through their democratic accountability in the cases of democratic cities, have significant power over steering these processes. Now, in terms of gentrification, I agree with you that this is not necessarily something that can easily be stopped, and nor would all urban governments or urban populations want to stop it. However, the most extreme versions of this, when it leads to physical displacement, when it leads to increasing housing need for poorer populations, these are things that can be addressed for government through tenure and rent controls, through more housing provision, non-market and semi-market housing provision, and also, of course, through protection of commercial rents, because something else that happens very importantly when areas are gentrifying is not simply residential gentrification, but commercial gentrification. So all the commercial services that previously were serving a relatively low-income neighborhood are pricing out, you know, much of the population because they're being geared to incoming populations.
Hi. Thank you very much for your great talk. And I like that we are ending with this image of the bikes and your talk about the use of bicycles in city, in your example from Bogota. Because I was wondering, I have commuted by bike in Stockholm, and what I have noticed is that in the central cities, it's not necessarily people with, at least from the looks of it, lower incomes that ride bicycles. Now people have like high-end gear bikes and these suits and maybe even electric bikes. And where I'm from Rotterdam, in lower income neighborhoods, mobility poverty is a big problem, and also people cannot really afford the upkeep and purchase of bicycles. So my question is basically, is the bicycle as a sort of like very accessible, low-cost means of transport, is that shifting or disappearing, or how does it work in London?
I very strongly agree with you on that point. I have been cycling myself in London. I've lived in London for almost 30 years and have cycled throughout that time, and it's my primary, and unless I have to get to the airport or the weather's really terrible, my only mode of transport in the city. The point I want to make about this, I guess, is about the distribution of space and the over-provision of space for private cars in many cities. And it's a growing global problem as well, not just in terms of private cars on the move, but especially private cars parked, which, as I said, is what they spend most of their time doing. A friend of mine has joked about purchasing in my neighbourhood and elsewhere in London, you can pay a very nominal sum to your local government. It's about £200 a year for a parking space on the street. And an architect friend of mine has joked about paying the £200 and then building, a spare bedroom on that space. He said, when you think about what that real estate is worth in a city like London, and they're giving it away for people to park their cars on, this is a noxious practice, and it's being facilitated in this way. So I wanted to make a point about how planners in this case distribute space amongst different kinds of users and different kinds of users. When it comes to the bicycle, I'm totally an adherent personally, but I'm ambivalent about it as a critic because it's also very gendered. Most of the time, if you took this photo, the cyclist would be a man in London. I was reading something in the Guardian newspaper just this morning, actually, that said given that men are twice as likely as women in London, well, this is throughout the UK rather, to routinely use a bicycle. The population share is half and half, but men are twice as likely to use a bicycle as their normal mode of transport. It was something like 9 out of the 13 fatalities on London roads last year of bicycle fatalities were women. So there is this sort of disincentive for women around safety and sort of cultures of cycling. But this is very anecdotal. Tigran doesn't mind anecdotes. I had a big argument with a dear friend of mine who's a very keen cyclist when I said, well, the more we give over to cycle lanes and so on, it's great, I'm all for it, we want cycling infrastructure, but you're basically providing transport infrastructure for predominantly white, predominantly middle class, predominantly male users. And if you want to do something which is socially egalitarian as well as spatially redistributive, then you've got to focus on buses and collective transport, but buses in particular. It's the bus that lower income people are most likely to use, particularly if they're living in more peripheral areas. And I must say, to the credit of the series of London mayors we've had since 2000, the money that's gone from the income that comes out of the congestion charge, that traffic demand management scheme, from car users goes into transport, and a lot of it has gone into bus services. So the city's no less congested than it was, it's just full of traffic jams of buses now.
A question maybe linking these two, making a bridge from Kyle to David. When we look at this image, and you made a caveat when you said interventions are a small scale. At the end, when you see these movements in public space and redesigning the public realm, they're never major. If they're major, they're usually done on a more strategic planning level. So do you think when will this be enough to make a real change? I mean, it's an incremental change, everything from pop-up DIYs, tactical things. Yeah. But when it will take a stronger wave, then you say, okay, now it's really become an inclusive movement. Or it will ever happen?
That's a tough one. I mean, it's never going to be like building a highway system, right? The way that has shaped cities historically, particularly North American cities in the second part of the 20th century, or Stockholm, indeed, in the second part of the 20th century. These are much more radical in the sense of extensive structural interventions, basic interventions in the fabric of the city. But the way that we can think about the question of scale in relation to these interventions is through a cumulative scale, not one big system scale, but the accretion, the accumulation of many, many interventions. And singular interventions like this form part of a wider strategy. The London government has a strategy for cycling as an important part of its transit strategy, and a strategy for collective transit, and of course I can't remember what we call it now, the driverless vehicles. This is the new thing that's coming. That are coming into our city spaces. So it has to be part of a larger strategy, but planning has to be local at the same time, because we all live our lives locally. We don't live our lives at city scale. And if we're thinking about this sociologically, interpersonally, then we need to think about this woman's experience of getting from A to B as part of a much wider network. And two other things just to observe about that comment, Tigran. One is that many of these initiatives have been a matter of learning from the Global South in terms of alternative transit strategies. It's a meeting of the green movement in Europe, let's say, and this sort of the social urbanism, as we now call it, of lower income governments. tactical urbanism is a similar case. It's about learning from these sometimes subversive, sometimes insurgent, but often poorly resourced forms of tactical urbanism, incrementalism, improvisation, informality in the cities of the global south that are more and more being translated into often quite cash-strapped contexts in the global north. But the other side of that, of course, is the way that that's also then colonized by governments and private developers who know that a little bit of tactical greening or a pop-up, is something to do while you're waiting for your development to take off. So that there are different ways in which these get integrated into the urban context.
Okay. Thank you for your lecture. I'm, as an urban designer, usually think about physical intervention in urban design projects, but it's not all related to improving gender equality in open spaces. And I was wondering about the position of educational issues in relation to urban designing, and I don't know how we can consider relationship between urban design and the factors which could develop the knowledge of people or community awareness rising. If it's possible, yeah.
Yeah, I think that picks up on Tigran's question earlier as well about the different sort of disciplinary perspectives that are needed. Clearly this program and this department is part of that effort, and the one that I've been involved with for many years is also the effort to bring together different kinds of expertise and different imaginations in thinking about the city, which is not to say that urban designers can all become lawyers and economists and psychologists and sociologists and all the sorts of insights that you would need to work in that multidimensional way. But I think the task of design education, certainly today, is to enhance the literacy of designers in relation to the way in which legal frameworks shape the city and their practice, the way that economic considerations constrain what designers could ever possibly do, and the way that they interact with their clients, with developers, with planners, and with so on. And to increase the social literacy of designers in terms of understanding the uses and the impacts and the demands for their practice. So a more holistic, dare I say, approach to urban design, I think, is very crucial, because the kinds of problems that designers, architects, planners, engineers are addressing in the city are they're never simply physical problems. You only come up with a physical intervention in order to do other things. Not because, maybe if you're a certain kind of architect, the object is the point. But for most designers, certainly anyone who would call themselves an urban designer, you are seeking to make physical interventions in pursuit of other objectives, to increase access, to promote livelihoods, to provide shelter, to provide spaces of gathering and interaction. That's what you want to do. And the physical form is the response to that. But in itself, the end is not the physical one. It's the social or the economic or the environmental one. So I think education has an absolutely critical role in that respect. And I'd be fairly confident that most people who enter in design programs, there may be some sort of fountainhead type, I want to make big, beautiful objects. But I think that social drive is often a very important part of the motivation to become a designer. And the field of education has to respond to that and help designers in training realize those aspects of their practice. Not that they're going to become experts, just as many of the social scientists that I work with in the education field are not going to be designers at the end of that process, but they're going to understand design, and they're going to know how to speak to designers about their work in ways which hopefully are going to be more productive in the way we make our cities.
Thank you so much, Fran, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you.